Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner. Recently, at the Mayfair Times Literary Festival in London, I was talking with Tony Lee Morrell, the author of Titan Books' all-new Alfred Hitchcock book, Alfred Hitchcock Storyboards, an amazing piece of work by Tony. And he was in conversation with myself and with Hitchcock expert Stephane Duckett, all about the master, Alfred Hitchcock's career. We recorded it in a very busy bar in a very lovely hotel. So there might be some extraneous noise, but if you channel in on the dialogue, it's a very interesting conversation, I think, and I hope you enjoy it. Take care. Good evening, everybody. I'm Andrew Sumner. I'm the Executive Vice President of Titan Entertainment and Titan Books. I'm also the host of the Forbidden Planet TV show on YouTube. I was the former host of the Uncut Film on TCM for many years, and it's lovely to welcome you here for the Mayfair Times Literary Festival. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, guys. And I'd like to introduce you to the one and only Stephane Duckett and filmmaker turned author Tony Lee Morrell. Give this gentleman a round of applause, please. The theme of this evening is one of my great heroes, Alfred Hitchcock. Both of these gentlemen have written fine books about Alfred Hitchcock. Stephane was, of course, Hitchcock in Context, which I think was published in 2014, am I right? And Tony is about to publish the Hitchcock Storyboards book that we're publishing at Titan Books in about November. So, if I could start with sit down. If I could start with you, please, Tony. Don't knock it. Yes, we're good. Start with you, please, Tony. What was the genesis to creating Hitchcock Storyboards?
Well, I've always wanted to do something on the visual art of Hitchcock because he's very much a visual storyteller. He thought very much in camera logic, cinema, what's in the frame. And I actually approached Titan 24 years ago. Heather, you probably don't know this, but...
We jumped on this
there was a managing editor you may know called Adam Newell. And I approached him about my Marnie book, which was my first Hitchcock book. And he looked at it and said, well, Marnie's too niche. Who was going to read the whole book on Marnie? So I didn't go with Titan on that occasion, but they're always in the back burner, because if you go to any bookshop in the UK, Waterstones, Blackwell's, and if you like me, you go to the film book section, and you're looking at all those gorgeous picture books on James Bond, on Star Wars, on Blade Runner. Invariably, they're a Titan book. So, having been rejected 24 years ago, I'm not good at rejection, so well, I'm going to pitch him again. So I did that 2 years ago, and luckily the managing editor at the time, who unfortunately moved on, he was a Hitchcock fan. And so I sent him a proposal, and he said, yeah, we've never done a big Hitchcock book, we'd love to do it. And because this was my fourth book, I was very much in with the Hitchcock estate, and they gave me carte blanche to publish from the Margaret Herrick Library in LA, which is where all the archives of Hitchcock storyboards are. And so the last 2 years I've just had great fun putting together this 10-chapter book on 9 or 10 of Hitchcock's best films, and I wanted to cover the whole period of Hitchcock, from the black and white, from the 39 Steps, which is my favourite film from his British period, to right up until his 50th feature, Torn Curtain. And so we go through the genesis of all his major landmarks, and it's told very much through the storyboard artists and the art directors rather than Hitchcock himself. Because Hitchcock is often seen as the auteur, the god, but he had a fantastic crew behind him, and he couldn't have made all those films without superb production designers, illustrators, and storyboard artists. So it's really a celebration of them as well.
I think that's very well said, Tony. The reality is, when you step forward with that proposal, there are many voices involved in approving the book. And it was something that we, and that's our PR director over there, Hannah Scudamore, were ourselves on board at Titan. We were, as you know, it was a very quick decision, because once you see the book, what you'll know is it's a very beautiful piece of work, really bewitching. It's not just Hitchcock history in prose, it's a visual, living, breathing memoir. So what are the challenges in putting it together, Tony?
Well, I think the major challenge, if I was going to tell it through the storyboard artists, unfortunately most of them have passed away now, But I was very fortunate with some of the early works, and there was a great storyboard artist you've probably never heard of. Her name is Dorothea Holt, and she's actually one of the first pioneering storyboard illustrators who was female in Hollywood. And anyone who's seen Gone with the Wind knows about the Tara staircase, and she designed that Tara staircase for David O. Selznick. And she says in her memoirs, I probably drew that down staircase 64 times for David O. Selznick. And she was really a pioneer in her industry, not only because she was a woman, but she was one of the first real storyboard artists. This was in the late 1930s, and America was coming out of the Depression at the time. And a lot of those storyboard artists actually started as architects. And it makes sense really, because they're obviously very good at fine drawings. And she, along with Robert Boyle, who was a very famous production designer on North by Northwest and Birds and Marnie, he was a schoolmate of hers. Henry Bumstead, who did Vertigo, they're all in the same class. And so it was fantastic to start with a female. And she wasn't quite the first, because I started with the 39 Steps, and there was an illustrator called Oscar Verndorf, who was a German emigre, and I can talk about him later. But Dorothea was fantastic because she really, stood for no nonsense. Anyone who knows David O. Selznick, he was like a rival auteur. He famously brought Hitchcock to America to do Rebecca, which was which was his first film. And so Dorothea drew this production sketches from Mandalay, which is in the book, the famous house in Rebecca. And she would use watercolour and washes, she would use these beautiful paints. And I spoke to her children, Lynn and her son, and they told me all about her technique, which was great in the book. And so it's very much about her craftsmanship, and I do that throughout the chapters.
Lovely. Well, let's take a step back for a second, Stephane. I know that you guys are close and been very supportive of Tony's work. How did your own involvement with the legacy of Hitchcock come about?
I work. I'm a psychologist, and I work in elderly care, and I was working in Hampstead at the time. And there are a lot of people involved in cinema that were amongst my patients and clients. And I came into contact with a number of people. I'd always admired Hitchcock a lot. So it sort of kicked off from there. And I was very fortunate to meet a number of people, particularly from Hitchcock's British productions. And actually it was Tony's book on Marnie that I was so deeply impressed by.
It's a great book.
It's a really super. There's another one also on the making of birds, which I strongly recommend. But it was that and some other publications that got me going really, and organising conferences.
And your own Hitchcock work, which again was a Marnie book, but this is beautiful publication. Your own Hitchcock in context. That's very arresting piece of work. Published about 10 years ago now.
Yeah, it was. Oh, wow.
This is a copy Stephane sent to me with a note I'll read later.
Okay, right. Yes, I mean, the main issue about that in my reading is that I think often we look at Hitchcock's creative, his production, and we fail to look at the historical context within which a number of these films, they all came out of. There were specific events that Hitchcock was responding to with each one of these films. And but sometimes that is neglected, I think, in a lot of the analysis of Hitchcock's films. And people look at his films in isolation, and as a result, it may seem quite strange. But if you look at it within the context of the world as it was at that time when he was creating that particular film, it begins to make sense. You begin to understand why it was that he chose to pursue the topics that he did.
I think that's such an important point, because world history is often such an influence on popular culture. And once you start to appreciate that popular culture 50 to 75 years after it was originally created, you're shorn of that with those reference points.
I mean, for instance, one example, I'll be brief about this, but one of his most popular films was The Man Who Knew Too Much, and as many of you will know, he made two versions of it. The only film he actually did twice. Well, the key event within the first version of The Man Who Knew Too Much was based on a historical event that Hitchcock had experienced himself directly, and that was the siege of Sydney Street in 1911. As a child, as a young boy, he had to take a tram. It was an electrified tram. There were horse-drawn, but he took an electrified tram that he would take to his school. So he would have seen the siege of Sydney Street, which the crowds there were about 20,000 people. It was an extraordinary 6-hour siege. And he witnessed this, and he recreated that in his first version of The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Very interesting. Tony, how many storyboard artists are represented in the book?
There's 9. So as I mentioned, let's start with Oscar Verdoff, who did the 39 Steps. And Hitchcock was very influenced in German Expressionism. He went over to the UFA studios in Berlin in the mid-1920s. And German Expressionism is very much about light and shade, shadows, distorted images. And when you watch the 39 Steps, it was actually filmed at Limegrove Studios, which is no more, but was in Shepherd's Bush. And they brought the set of the Scottish Highlands there with the running water and the moors. And it's all about, Hitchcock was all about what you see through the camera lens, which is important. You know, anything else which you don't see beyond the set didn't really matter. So it was very much, I love the 39 Steps. I know you do as well. And I just wanted to start with the 39 Steps because also it's got that fantastic Robert Donat in it, who Hitchcock said was actually his favourite leading man. You might think it was Cary Grant or James Stewart, but I asked Norman Lloyd, who was a good friend of Hitchcock, and he said it was Robert Donat because he personified the man on the run, the English gentleman, the man wrongly accused, and because of his theatrical training, he's just like a superb actor. He can do comedy, he can do drama. You know, the scenes of him pulling Madeline Carroll across the moors when they're handcuffed together is just genius. And so I really wanted to start with the 39 Steps, and so I approached the British Film Institute. And actually there were stills in the BFI which had never been published before because they weren't catalogued as storyboards, and that was absolutely delightful. I said to the editor, we've got to include them. So there's new images in that book. And then, as I mentioned, I go on to talk about Dorothea Holt, and she did Shadow of a Doubt, which is very much Hitchcock coming to terms with the small town America. It's fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. And then I wanted to go through the time periods when I go to Spellbound, mainly because of Salvador Dali. He was very much influential in the dream sequence, and obviously him being a big name artist, and we got permission from the Salvador Dali Foundation to publish some of his original artwork, which is in the book. And then we go to Vertigo, Henry Bumstead, who's a close friend of Hitchcock, and it was the production design. If you've seen Vertigo, is gorgeous. Every frame is just a masterpiece, like a painting in my opinion. And then I go through the classics, North by Northwest, Psycho, The Birds, Marnie. And I was actually going to end it with Marnie, but then I discovered that there were a couple of storyboard artists who were still alive. And one of them is Joseph Mussow, and he was a storyboard artist on Torn Curtain, which was made in 1965, and it isn't great Hitchcock, it's his 50th film, but because Joseph was still with us, I just had to get all his memories, and no one had really interviewed him. So he talks about the very famous scene in the museum in East Berlin where Paul Newman is being chased by the Stasi, and the very famous killing of Gromek scene in the farmhouse. If you haven't seen Torn Curtain, it's just kind of a masterpiece about how difficult it is to kill someone rather than bang you're dead. And then the famous theatre scene at the end of Torn Curtain. And it was fantastic to do that because Hein Heckroth was a production designer. Anyone who's seen the Red Shoes, it's gorgeous, that imagery. And so Hitchcock wanted to use a German production designer who knew about what life was like behind the Iron Curtain. So he hired Hein Heckroth to do it. And I spoke to Heckroth's grandson, Jody Ruth, about him. He gave me some fantastic stories. And then we had the afterword. We ended in Topaz and Family Plot, which again is lesser Hitchcock, but I had to I had to include it because Thomas Wright is still with us. He's a storyboard artist on Hitchcock's last film, which was made in 1976. And we actually begin the book with, again, another unpublished image of a sketch which Thomas Wright did of Hitchcock, which is in colour, and that's never been published before. To have that opening was really exciting.
I think one of the things that's exciting about the book is that you do actually cover not just family plot, which is a kind of curio, if you will, but also Torn Curtain and Topaz, which I personally think are woefully underrated. And Torn Curtain is one of Tarantino's favorites.
Oh, I didn't know that because it's normally quite disparaging about Hitchcock.
Yeah, he is.
Maybe it's that murder scene which you like so much.
I think that's got something to do with it, and that's such a well-made point. The difficulty, because if you follow a lot of films, you would think that taking people out is a relatively easy endeavour, which it isn't. And it does really evoke that very clearly. Somebody you mentioned in passing, I just want to pick up about, was the great Norman Lloyd, one of the great character actors of the 20th century. A phenomenally long lived into his, I don't know, 102, 105, starred in St. Elsewhere when he was in his 80s. What was it like speaking with him?
It was amazing. I went to see him twice in his home in Brentwood, and as you say, he was probably 99, 100 when I last saw him. But extremely sharp, very erudite. I would arrive in this Brentwood home in California, and he'd be wearing an immaculate three-piece suit, with a copy of a New Yorker by his side. Such a classy gentleman. And anyone who's seen Saboteur knows he started as an actor. He was a guy playing Frank Fry, hanging off the Statue of Liberty in Saboteur. But he was a very good friend of Hitchcock, not only through being an actor, but because he was a producer on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the TV series in the 1960s. So he knew Hitchcock very well, and he gave us some great stories about him.
And that leads into another really interesting thing about Hitchcock, I think, which is he's really the first superstar film director outside of, say, somebody who existed as an actor. I'm thinking Orson Welles. Orson Welles is a very famous director, very famous person. But I think Hitchcock is the best example I can think of in the pre-Spielberg time period of a director who became famous himself for being himself. Stephane, in your work in terms of the work you've done about his career, you're in contact, do you have any thoughts about that?
I do actually. Hitchcock learned that. He understood that he needed to create a brand, the Hitchcock brand, and that would help selling films. And he actually learned that from Griffiths. His wife, Alma Rethel, actually worked for Griffiths for a short period of time. He also learned it from an English director whose reputation is somewhat lost at this point, named Graham Cutts, who's a silent film director. His bad behaviour on set, unfortunately, meant that his career was relatively short. He didn't really survive into the speaking era. But he did brand himself to the English public at the time. So it was both Griffiths and Cutts that influenced Hitchcock into understanding it was as much about selling himself as Alfred Hitchcock, the director, as also selling his films.
And do you think that's a process that he relished? Or he saw it as a mission?
I think he just understood that was a part of his job. There was an anecdote that I heard his granddaughter that might be one of your books, Tony, where the granddaughter was taken out to dinner by her illustrious grandfather, and they're sitting down, and several times people come up and say to him, "Oh, you must be Alfred Hitchcock. Would you sign this napkin for me?" and that sort of thing. And at the end of it, the granddaughter turned around him and said, "Doesn't this annoy you?" And he said, "No, this is why we've done as well as we've done. This is why we survived. These are the people that keep my electricians and my actors employed. So why would I resent that?" So I think he was acutely aware of the importance of himself as part of that marketing. And of course, so he wasn't always the person that he sometimes presented himself. On the Hitchcock Hour, we often see this sort of somewhat pompous at times individual, and he liked to play himself up as sinister. But actually, he was just a family man And in some ways, he was quite an ordinary, and obviously wasn't ordinary, he was an absolutely extraordinary person. But in his private life, he was actually very ordinary in a lot of ways. But that wasn't going to sell films. So if he presents himself as being some sinister, dark figure, that's more likely to sell films. But unfortunately, some people confuse the two and believe that sinister is the person that he was, which wasn't the case.
Tony, when did you first encounter Hitchcock yourself, his work?
I was 10 or 11 years old and I watched I Confess on television. And I Confess is a 1951 film with Montgomery Clift and Anne Baxter. And Montgomery Clift plays a priest in Canada. And he is sworn to secrecy by the Catholic rites of confession because a murderer actually confesses to him. And then he becomes the suspect and he can't divulge that he knows a murderer. So there's all this conflict and ambiguity, which is classic Hitchcock. So that was my first Hitchcock film. And even at the age of 10 years old, I could see something very special about this director through the storytelling, through the characterization, through the kind of moral conflict. And so it really resonated with me. And then when I got to college later on, I picked up a copy of Robin Wood's Hitchcock Films, which is just a seminal book for anyone who's interested in Hitchcock scholarship. The way he writes was just so lucid. And so I read the chapters and then went and watched all of his films because I was just so completely intrigued about it.
How about yourself, then? When did you first encounter Hitchcock?
My mother was a Hitchcock fan, and I remember when I was, this may not reflect completely responsible parenting, but I'll say it anyway. When I was rather small, my mother told me about the Psycho, that she had gone to see it when it first came out. And at that age, I didn't understand the storyline at all. But the one thing I distinctly remembered my mother telling me was the behavior of the adults in the theater. She said she jumped up in her seat and ended up sitting in the man's lap that was next to her, and adults were screaming. And I remember as a child thinking, being quite surprised about that. That's all I remembered, except the name Hitchcock, and that he really engaged his audiences.
I think that's very interesting. For me, it was my parents were big Hitchcock fans, and the thing they oriented me to when I was very small was this guy appears in all his own films. So I wouldn't necessarily see them all, but I'd be sat there in the lounge in the first 10 to 15 minutes and go, that's him, that's the director. And until I was old enough, that would be maybe I was 5 or 6, until I was old enough to see them. Is there any? Do you have any thoughts upon the breadth of his cameos and how he planned those out?
Well, at the beginning, in the 1920s, he famously says that he used to be a set decorator, a screenwriter, assistant director, and so when they needed an extra, you just pull people from the crew and put them in the background. And so that's how it all started, because like economy of scale. And then it just became a habit, and the audience started to expect and look out for them. And so he had to be more inventive, but often he wanted to put his cameo right at the beginning. So if you watch North by Northwest, he just misses the bus. Or on the birds, he's bringing in the dogs while Tippi Hedren walks into the bird shop. And so it became a bit of a chore, but with some funny gimmicks like strangers on the train. He's carrying this double bass when Farley Granger gets off the train, and in Torn Curtain he's holding a baby. But I think it just became part of the Hitchcock brand after a while.
I mean, I imagine it was supercharged by his television thing. Once Presents became the worldwide phenomenon that it was, then it was something that he really had to get into. Do you have any, and I know they're all favourites of yours, Tony, do you have any particular favourites that are covered in the storyboards book that you found particularly enlightening?
Well, I'd always quote North by Northwest to any Hitchcock audience or person to introduce Hitchcock. It's just such a classic film. You can watch it on a loop, it's just perfection. And it's very accessible because it works on many levels. I mean, the James Bond films were very much inspired by North by Northwest. If you think of a crop duster sequence in North by Northwest, and then From Russia with Love has a helicopter scene just a couple of years later. So I'd always quote North by Northwest, and I do quite a big deep dive in the book in North by Northwest because there's been some controversy in the past whether the storyboards were designed for the crop duster attack. And I spoke to the daughter of Mentor Hubner, who did the storyboards under the direction of Robert Boyle, the production designer. We got to the bottom of it. But I don't want to reveal all the secrets. So, but buy the book and you'll find out the story.
Amen. And did you find things out about talk about some of the later movies that are not as well regarded, the Torn Curtains, the Topaz, the Family Plot? What was it like speaking to the actual people who still existed who were storyboarding?
Well, I was amazed to find Joseph Musser, as I said, from Torn Curtain, because he was on Torn Curtain in 1965. He was about 23 years old. He told me he'd just been out of art college. He told me what it was like to be at the Hitchcock bungalow. Hitchcock had the bungalows at Universal Studios, which were very kind of long and elongated, with Hitchcock's office, and then he could walk down through the various departments. Jason told me Hitchcock would often poke his head over Joseph's shoulder as he was sketching, because Hitchcock himself started as an artist because he worked for a telegram company, and then when he was employed for Famous Players Lasky, which was an American company coming over to London, he did the title designs for the movies. So Hitchcock was very much, and there are a couple of sketches in the book which we include, Hitchcock's own sketches. So Joseph gave me some fantastic stories, and then I was amazed also finding Tom Wright, again, 1976 Family Plot, and he FaceTimed me, and he was this great long-haired hippie guy in like California, FaceTiming me and working with Hitchcock, and telling me about his stories working with him. And contrary to popular opinion, he was saying Hitchcock was so kind to him as a young artist, would invite him over for afternoon aperitif snack and a glass of wine, you know, and encouraged him to become a film director, sponsored him into the Directors Guild. So, you know, all those classic stories in there.
And what can you share about Topaz?
Well, very, very fortunately, Tom Wright's first job was on Topaz in 1968, and I actually like Topaz, like yourself, and it's a gorgeous colour film. Hitchcock very much thinks in colour palettes. If you think of Marnie, it's the reds and the browns. Topaz is about the yellow, reds and purples, because it's about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the kind of differences between the Americans and the French. So he's a very clever colour scheme. But he told me there was one sequence towards the end in the French embassy when Hitchcock wanted some light on the floor, and there wasn't enough light coming through the windows. So Tom Wright said he actually had to sketch and colour in the light on the floor, and so Hitchcock, contrary to a lot of people, was very invested in Topaz.
That's very interesting. Something that I really remember acutely from when I was quite young is watching the American Film Institute salute to Hitchcock when he was still alive. And I was watching it with my dad, and there was everybody, all the big Hollywood stars were coming and paying tribute to Hitchcock, and he was taking it all, and Sean Connery appears, looking very different to how he looked in Marnie, and you can see Hitchcock turn to his hand and go, "Who's that?" And then he starts talking, he's like, it's Sean Connery. He stands up and waves at him and, you know, gives him his kudos. But you're a big fan of Marnie, wrote a whole book about it. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, he chose Sean Connery. Originally, they wanted a classic Philadelphia gentleman, someone who came from old money, someone who was a publisher, distinguished, kind of Philadelphia mainline, and they were looking at various actors, possibly Laurence Olivier, if he could, you know, play the American, and they were looking, and then him and the writer just saw a screen test, or maybe they got, I think they saw From Russia with Love, and they saw Sean Connery with his big, broad Scottish accent, and they just looked at each other and said, let's do it, let's just go for it. But Tippi Hedren makes a good point. She says, it's very convincing that Marnie is frigid, because what woman could turn down Sean Connery? And so it was superb casting.
At the peak of his masculinity, yeah, for sure. You're both fans of Shadow of a Doubt, yeah. Stephane, could you talk a bit about your feelings about that movie?
it was, I think I'm right in saying that it was Amarella's favourite film. It was Hitchcock's favourite film, and mainly because it went so smoothly. There were no big egos on set. Everybody worked very cooperatively. So in a lot of ways, we remember that well. He was also working with a very prestigious writer at the time of our town. What's the name of the author?
Thornton Wilder.
Thornton Wilder, thank you. And he really enjoyed that working relationship. He was probably, I think, one of the most prestigious writers that he'd worked on. So altogether, I think, was such a positive experience for him. But I think a lot of people have difficulty with that film because it's extremely dark.
Yes, absolutely.
And it has a very sinister side to it. So I think it struggles to find an audience in some ways.
When I think it rewards because it has such a towering lead performance, but that's part of the problem, isn't it? You feel so genuinely unnerving.
Yeah.
What about from a storyboard perspective? I know it's one of the ones we covered.
Yeah, I was very, very excited to cover Shadow of a Doubt. Again, because of Dorothea Holt, she moved from working with Selznick and working with Hitchcock from Rebecca, and she was Californian herself. She was from LA. She was very interested in antiques and period furniture. And if you look at Shadow of a Doubt, when I was in Santa Rosa, I went to visit the house, which was in MacDonald Avenue, and Hitchcock wanted a typical American suburban home because this was his real first look into small town America. And she did all the fine furniture details in Shadow of a Doubt. The Newton family, when you see the young girl at the beginning, she's reading Ivanhoe and eating an apple, and there's like this classic furniture around her. And it's such a famous house that the surveyors say that they want to come and see the house because they want a typical American family. And of course, Hitchcock loved that. He loved creating the ordinary and placing the extraordinary, the evil. And so Uncle Charlie arrives within this milieu and like inserts himself and hides himself in this what you would think is small town, everyday suburbia. And again, I think it was one of the films which David Lynch was quite inspired by because it reminds you of Blue Velvet as well.
Absolutely. Which, of course, is a film with a remarkably unnerving tone, which is what one of the great lessons Lynch took from Hitchcock. It's unnerving the minute it starts. You don't really know why. Some of the takes, the scenes take a long time. The camera lingers on people in an unusual way. So that was. I'm thinking perhaps in my mind's eye, the Hitchcock film, and I know this is the case, that its reputation has perhaps grown the most since it was released, and it was well received when it was released, is Vertigo, which has gone on to at times supplant Citizen Kane from the #1 position on the AFI list, the global film list, sound list. What that must have been a joy going through, because that's such a beautifully composed film. It must have been a joy going through those storyboards.
It was, and as I mentioned, Henry Bumstead was the production designer. He did a few of Hitchcock films, like the second version of The Man Who Knew Too Much, up until Family Plot. But I was very fortunate. I spoke to his son Bob since Henry had passed away, and he gave me some great stories. Henry was drawing since he was 6 years old. He was really could get the anatomy down of a person or a horse. And again, as I was saying, he started in architecture. And so when you look at the architecture of Vertigo, you see all the blueprints, not only the famous buildings like the Bell Tower in San Juan Bautista, which is near Carmel, but also Mission Dolores. There's some very famous sets in Vertigo. There's Scotty's apartment, which is with a backdrop of Coit Tower. There's Midge's apartment, which is very modern, contrasted Scotty's bachelor apartment. And there's Gavin Elster, who's the villain. His gorgeous office right at the beginning, which is all oak, and he's a shipping magnate. Oaks, and Hitchcock liked that set so much, he asked Henry to design it for his home in Scottsdale for his retreat.
That's such a lovely anecdote. What are your thoughts on Vertigo?
Well, it's an extraordinarily beautiful film. I mean, visually, and very beguiling. And Hitchcock had a lot of confidence in that. It's based on a French novel, a pulp story, which was unremarkable in a lot of ways. But he really transformed that into something poetic. It's beautiful. It's almost like a ghost story, really. But as you said, it wasn't well received when it came out. Audiences were disappointed. Hitchcock had confidence in it, enough that he knew not to sell it on to, not to allow TV to be able to broadcast it. And he kept it on ice and saying that the audience will eventually grow to enjoy that. So I think he understood that this was truly a great film, and but it just took some time for us as audiences to mature sufficiently to be able to appreciate that.
I think that's very well said. That's absolutely the case. And I think perhaps there's a degree to which audiences at the time weren't ready to see James Stewart play that particular character, somebody who's so layered and complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Now, another favourite of mine, Spellbound, which I know is in the book. So, what was your journey with the storyboards on Spellbound?
It was actually really interesting to do Spellbound. It's never been a favourite Hitchcock. You think I'd like it because it's very much a precursor of Marnie. It's very much psychoanalysis, the story of a mind. But I rewatched it and I was actually really quite taken with it, with the photography. I mean, the way Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck lit, they're just so luminous. And it's a very beautiful film. And the Dali storyboards were just fascinating to do. And I went to the storyboards and the Selznick files at the University of Austin, Texas at Austin. And Hitchcock, and especially David O. Selznick, who said was very difficult to work with, he didn't like any of the Dali storyboards to begin with and said, it's just unworkable, we can't film that. Dali had all these ideas about Ingrid Bergman turning into a statue and then the statue breaking into ants. And he was saying, well, how can we possibly film this? So they took the best of Dali's sketches and they hired another storyboard artist called James Pavese to do sketches from it, and they contracted it from, I think it was a 5-minute sequence to about 2.5 in the original film, taking the essence of it. But there's some great things in the book which we talk about the forced perspective, which is a technique they use for the vertigo zoom. And there was a ballroom sequence which was cut where Bergman and Peck are dancing in the foreground. And again, this is German expressionism. To give that forced perspective of ballroom dancers, they actually use dwarfs at the far end. And so it's a kind of distorted image when you look at it. But I spoke to a great artist who gave me some great insight into Salvador Dali. If you look at some of his paintings, like the persistence of memory, the melting clocks, the melting wheels, all those motifs are in the Spellbound sequence.
Are you a Spellbound?
I am, but I think as with Tony, for me, it's more it's so visually beguiling.
Yeah.
That particularly that dream sequence is just super, and so it's more about visually for me that even Hitchcock was somewhat dubious. I think he described the psychoanalysis there as hope, and that I'm less convinced about that aspect of it. But of course, in 1940s America, we were all fascinated by Freud and psychoanalysis. We had just come out of the World War, in which there were extraordinarily horrible things that human beings had done to other human beings. And we were asking ourselves why. And it appeared that psychoanalysis had the answer somehow, that there's this unconscious. So it met its audience. But I think from a modern point of view, it's more difficult to kind of accept that kind of naive expression of psychoanalysis. But visually, it's extraordinarily beautiful, and the actors are a pleasure to look on. So they
really that's Hollywood at the peak of its fascination with human beauty.
Yeah,
and everybody just looks impeccable.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, that film was initially was based on the House of the Edwards, which was actually a horror story in which the devil actually appears halfway through. And Hitchcock initially said, this is not workable, we've got to get rid of the devil, but let's bring in psychoanalysis, because it takes place in a psychiatric facility. And he actually wanted to start it off, I think, with going through a real psychiatric facility to show treatment underway, to give it a kind of realistic touch. But of course, with Selznick, all of that went, and the fantasy element was really pushed forward with that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, it's interesting talking about the textual elements of Hitchcock's career, because it covered such a long period of time, and the standard of his work was so high. The beauty of this conversation with the two of you, very knowledgeable about Hitchcock, is makes you realise that while there are certain films that dominate who we think Hitchcock is here in 2023, and there's probably every can name 5 or 6 key Hitchcock films, actually, just by modern standards, every film is a gem. And when you dig into it, everything is worth analysing. And you made me think specifically then of how, as censorship standards relaxed throughout the course of his career, how he particularly, more than any other director I can think of, kept on course correcting to be able to cover things he wasn't able to do previously. And the first, for me, step change, 2 degrees vertical, the first real obvious step change, obvious to everybody, I think, was Psycho, which of course is one of his absolute keynote films. So what were you able to find out about the Psycho storyboards?
Well, you can't really do a book on Hitchcock's storyboards without including Psycho, because it's probably the most famous storyboarding of a shower sequence by Saul Bass, and the Arbogast murder. They're just like pinnacles still to this day. Film students around the world, directors emulate it. Like with the storyboard sequence, it's 76 frames of montage. And Saul Bass, who started off in titles, he did the titles for Vertigo, he did the graphic titles for North by Northwest. He's no longer with us, but I spoke to his daughter Jennifer Bass, who gave me some great stories, and she said he would design the storyboards, Hitchcock would go on the set. But another scoop of mine was interviewing the body double for Janet Leigh, his name is Marley Renfro. She was a nudist, unashamed nudist, body double, 21 years old, living in LA, and she was called upon by Hitchcock to stand in for Janet Leigh during the shower sequence. And she said she spent 3 to 4 days just nude in front of the crew. She said the sound guy had never been next to a naked woman before, was shaking his boom so much. And so Hitchcock would refer to the storyboards, and they're all laid out in the book. But there's also a very interesting story of how the storyboards and the Arbogast murder digress. I don't want to go into too much again, read the book. But Saul Bass wanted to do it one way, but Hitchcock chose another. That very famous crane shot, it goes up to high angle, the mother comes out and stabs Arbogast in the eye.
Beautiful. It's interesting. One of the other things we were about to publish at Titan is a graphic novel called Mother Nature, written by Jamie Lee Curtis, and we'll be debuting that at San Diego Comic Con in a few weeks. And I was talking to JLC, as she likes to be known recently, and her mother that was the film of which her mum was most proud within the family, and she had a great time with Hitchcock. She had a wonderful time and a wonderful relationship with everybody. It made me think, Stephane, given the fact that Psycho fits so heavily in the DNA of how you came to experience Hitchcock, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's so iconic, the images from that a few years back there was a Psycho was screened at one of the theatres, and there was a full orchestra there, and I thought, oh, this might be fun. I'll go out and see that. But the audience was almost all very young people, and I thought, oh, how are they going to react? And I was waiting for the big moments of the, Arbogast's stabbing But the audience, and I was thinking, oh, they're going to shout and scream or what? No, not at all. They didn't seem to be troubled by any of the violence. They didn't seem to react to the things that I would have reacted to, or that previous audiences has reacted to. Because of course, audiences are very different now. They've you know, Psycho has come and gone. There's a different level of violence, obviously, that we're willing to accept and to tolerate within films. But somehow it still rings true. It still feels credible, the storyline, despite the fact that it's black and white, and that it's obviously takes place in the early 60s and the late 50s. There's still something about it that feels credible and believable.
I think that's very true, and it's really lived on in popular culture way beyond
Extraordinarily.
just the original film. I mean, I remember when I was a kid watching an episode of Happy Days, right? And Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham are about to go out to the movies, and Ralph Mouth, who is one of Richie's intellectually challenged friends, who's about to leave, ruins the punchline. In case anybody hasn't seen it, I imagine you all have. Ruins the punchline of the movie, and I thought, but even when I watched that in that moment, I knew how that movie ended because it had been explained to me so enthusiastically by my parents. And what I'd like to segue out of Psycho into would be, and a Hitchcock film is not actually a tremendous favourite of mine, which is The Birds. So what did you find out from The Birds storyboards, and what's your feeling about that film?
Well, I've just written a whole book on The Birds for the 50th anniversary, so this was a challenge. That was in 2013. And I talk about all the techniques of green screen and sodium vapor and storyboards and live birds, mechanical birds, and miniature birds. And I was thinking, what on earth can I say which is new? But there were things in the Academy Library which had been published before, and they were very much beautiful sketches by Robert Boyle. So again, I focused on Boyle. He's got some beautiful colour sketches of the Brenner House. And again, him being an architect, the house is very much a character in The Birds, like Manderley is a character in Rebecca, or in Under Capricorn, Minyaga is the name of the house is a character as well. And so very much looked at the architecture of the house, because that the very famous attic sequence at the end, that becomes very important, the geography of the house and how the birds were able to penetrate. So I concentrated on that, and as well as obviously the famous school scene, which is again a masterclass in suspense, when Melanie is sitting smoking a cigarette and the birds one by one landing with Jungle Jim behind her, and it's just a superb example of Hitchcock cross-cutting and use of montage. So we include all those storyboards.
Yeah, because there was some, and you touched upon that, and I know you write about it length in the book, some genuine technical innovations in that. What do you think of The Birds?
I just want to come back to mention about Tony's book on The Birds. It's absolutely excellent, and one of the things that I particularly enjoyed about that is that you talked about how difficult, challenging the production. I love the fact that you interviewed some of the bird trainers involved in that sort of thing you don't really think about, but somebody had to teach that bird and that was absolutely fascinating, and quite how complex that was, because it really is quite I don't know, for those of you that, if you've seen The Birds recently, but there are very few films, science fiction, horror films from that period where the special effects, they still hold for you. I mean, most of them, you see them and you kind of think, oh, well, yeah, this is not up to modern standards. But The Birds manages to maintain that tension, and it's still very credible. Well, I think what Tony's book does, that was very different from anything previously written about that, is to show quite how much work went into producing what was a very realistic product. And part of what made it realistic, of course, was the fact that there was no music, which was very unusual for the time. And there was these very strange sound effects that are involved. We talk about them.
He wanted to use an electronic score, so he hired a couple of pioneering composers from Germany to do an electronic score, or the bird cries and the bird side, starting with a title sequence, and then when you see the birds on the telephone wire outside of Brenner House, and then the bird cries right at the end. So when I first saw the birds, I was just knocked out by that score. It's so unsettling and so unnerving.
I've never really liked the birds, as I've said, and it's made me, you're making me want to revisit it now. So it's been ages since I've seen it, so I feel like I need to give it another go. And let's close out before we take a few questions in a moment about not one of Hitchcock's greatest, but one I feel that it's important to cover, and indeed you did cover it, which is Family Plot. Which is a very unusual film for him to close out on, I've always thought, and on some levels never thought it had quite the production quality of some of his classics. But what was the journey you went on storyboards for that movie?
Well, it wasn't supposed to be his last film, because he was doing The Short Night in 1979, but he was at the age of 79. You can't go on forever. And so, again, I was very fortunate with Thomas Wright, who's still with us. He told me that he was storyboarding and actually acting as an assistant director for Hitchcock, and being a second unit director. There's a very famous scene in Family Plot where Bruce Dern and Barbara Harris are in a car, runaway car, and the brakes have gone, and Hitchcock just wanted to keep it on them, and so the camera's on them all the time, and it's just great comic acting. He didn't like establishing shots where you just cut away to a train or a car, so he kept it very much in the interior, so that was carefully storyboarded. And there's the other famous sequence, which is shot in the San Francisco cemetery, which is in the book. Hitchcock loved the idea of parallel couples coming together and meeting, which is what Family Plot is designed on. And so there's a great chase in the cemetery between Bruce Dern and Catherine Nesbitt, and it's a high angle shot, and it's almost like a chess game, and then they actually meet in the middle.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I always thought that Bruce Dern, who I've always loved, was such an interesting choice for a Hitchcock leading man. Such a departure from the kind of guys who worked on 20 years earlier. At this point, does anybody have any questions for Tony or for Stephane? Please.
First, I've really enjoyed this, and I look forward to the book coming out. My question is, Marnie, which is a film that I love, has some very artificial aspects to it. And the two things that occur to me off the top of my head is when she's on a horse, which is not a horse at all, but more critically, that scene where it's a is it Baltimore street that ends in a dock, and there's a painting of a ship, which is so obviously a painting of a ship, and I kind of like the surreal quality that gives. And my question to you is that, do you think that was deliberate or do you think it was purely economy of production? Do you think it was deliberate to create a surreal quality? Or do you think it just ended up being that way? Because I think that a backdrop could have been done that would have been less obvious.
Sure. Well, I write about all that in the Marnie book. And again, with the challenge with the Marnie chapter is what else is there new to say about it? So I concentrated on the horse riding and the hunt sequence in particular. And I was fortunate to interview the stunt doubles who are still alive. They're outside Pennsylvania. So Hitchcock went with a second unit to film the hunt sequence. And it was a combination of location work. It was a combination of studio work. Amazingly, they had Tippi Hedren and Diane Baker on real horses on treadmills in front of the back projection to film the close-ups. That was economy because it will take a lot of time and effort to bring your stars over to Philadelphia main line to shoot a real hunt. And they actually used a studio rocking horse as well from Disney, where they actually had the horse in this cradle and rocked. So some of the foreground shots of Hedren riding, you see that rocking motion. So it was mainly economy because Hitchcock loved studio filming because he hated the vagaries of the weather going out. He didn't like coming out of his limousine when he was filming Family Plot in San Francisco, and there's no way he'd go over to Baltimore or Philadelphia to shoot these sequences. And he was very conscious of lighting, especially with his leading lady. So he wanted headroom to look well lit. He wanted Baker to look well lit. So that's that for the horse riding sequences. For the big ship in Baltimore, anyone who hasn't seen Marnie, when she first arrives at her mother's house in Baltimore, it's a very narrow perspective, again, German expressionism, and there's a big, very obvious painted backdrop of a ship looming, almost blocking the street exit. And Hitchcock said he was inspired because he grew up in East London. He was inspired by the docks of his childhood, where the ships seemed to come up from the docks and actually dwarf the houses. So again, there was a lot of his own childhood impressions on that. But Robert Boyle, who designed that painting, I spoke to him about it at length. Originally, it was supposed to be a high-angle shot, but Hitchcock changed his mind last minute and wanted a low-angle shot, and that distorted the perspective of the ship, which is why it looks so fake. But if you remember, Hitchcock and Boyle had done big-scale set designs before, because they'd just done North by Northwest Mount Rushmore. And Mount Rushmore was actually a backdrop as well. But no one complains about Mount Rushmore the way they do about the Marnie ship. So I think it was a combination of Hitchcock changed his mind and he wanted to rain on set. And that didn't make the matte painting look good when you have a rain machine. So that made it even look more false. But it's wonderful how, again, Robin Wood, who's a very influential critic, he says that all parts of Marnie's charm, because we get to feel her alienation. And when Peter Bogdanovich said that to Hitchcock, which is on tape, Hitchcock replied, "I think that's a very good idea."
Anyone else? Sir?
Yeah, it's a two-part question. If you think if Hitchcock wasn't an overweight repressed Catholic, would his films be half as interesting? And secondly, I love the fact that he's heralded as this great artist, rightly so, in the 20th century, but he birthed the modern horror film with Psycho, you could argue. Who are your favourite? I'm a big fan of Brian De Palma, and I think he's one of the best disciples of Hitchcock, pure cinema. There's people like Richard Franklin in Australia, everything from Fatal Attraction to Basic Instinct. Who is your favourite sort of disciple of Hitchcock who still adheres to that sort of film grammar, which I work in film distribution. Modern cinema is sadly lacking in terms of, pure cinema, telling stories without words.
I actually cover that in my third book. I did a new edition last year. It's called The Young Alfred Hitchcock's Movie Making Masterclass, and I wanted to cover that topic. Who are the directors who've taken the Hitchcock baton? And there's a few that I talk about in the book. There's Matt Reeves, who did The Batman. If you watch the first 10 minutes of The Batman, it's very much told through point of view, through looking and ending in that horrific sequence when the mayor gets killed. There's Park Chan-wook, who did Decision to Leave last year. If anyone's seen that, it's very much like a Vertigo homage. There's Steven Soderbergh is a fan of Hitchcock. I don't know if anyone saw Kimmy a couple of years ago, but that was very much about, again, witnessing or hearing a murder, and that's very much in the Hitchcockian style. So there's quite a few. The guy who did Parasite, Bong Joon-ho. Yeah. He's very he's very big on Hitchcock. He's very influenced by Psycho, and so him as well. Do you think of this?
Well, there's also a number of French directors. I mean, Chabrol is one of the ones who was most. But you also mentioned David Lynch.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Hitchcock in Lynch. And looking at, and I like The Stranger with the Chain and Blue Velvet, the comparison, that's absolutely spot on. I would completely agree.
It's that, for me, it's that unnerving gaze of the camera with Lynch that feels very good.
Yes, the lingering shots, and beneath the sort of the ordinary, there is something dark at least. That is, So.
Yeah, one of you mentioned Soderbergh. I think I remember this correctly. There's that Soderbergh side effects. Is that what it's called? Side effects? I don't know if you've
Oh,
seen
yes,
that.
yeah.
It's about
Six.
it's set in the middle. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's definitely got a real Hitchcock vibe.
Absolutely, yeah.
What's your favourite De Palma film?
Probably of the Hitchcock ones, Dressed to Kill.
Well,
Just a massive.
Henry Green was, yeah, but sure.
I mean, the thing is, that film would be cancelled now, as was probably a lot of that sort of slasher type movies. But in terms of pure cinema, murder sequences, what did Hitchcock say? Film your murder sequences like love. What's the quote? Film your love scenes like murder sequences, and film your murder scenes like love scenes. I think that's what's missing now. But you know.
Yeah.
100% great music.
And yet, I would challenge that a little bit, because if you look at the murder sequence of Gromek and Torn Curtain that we were referencing over, he was very, there was no music there. If you look at other murder sequences from films from that particular period, like Sam Peckinpah, there's slow motion, there's dramatic music, and it's not real. And he wanted to present, this is what murder is, to take somebody else's life, this is what it is, and to be as realistic as possible, so people are under no illusion that of quite what a shocking thing it is. So that's why the Gromek scene is done the way it's done, very realistically, and not romanticized, not glossed over. He was very preoccupied with that. So, yeah, sorry, I'm running
I
mouth
totally
here.
agree.
And can I just mention that Stephane has a symposium in September? Can I do a quick plug?
Please
Oh.
do. Of course, now's the time.
You should tell us about it.
Yes, we, myself and Hitchcock scholar Charles Barr, we've been co-organising a series of conferences looking at Hitchcock's films that maybe have received less critical attention for various reasons, or are in need of some review. So Under Capricorn was one of them. And we are focusing this September on the 7th and the 8th at University College London, 7th and 8th of September, on I Confess, which was Hitchcock's only film that actually addressed his Catholicism. And we feel that that hasn't received enough attention. So it rather pleased me right at the very start you made mention of I Confess.
Actually, I think it was a gentleman over there.
Was it?
Yeah.
Much appreciated that you
So
did.
I know he's a repressed Catholic.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. And anyway, if you want to hear more about that, there are 20 of us that are getting
What is it?
together. It's at University College London, 7th and 8th of September. And if you go onto Eventbrite, you'll be able to register there. And we've got speakers that, well, Tony will be there, but we've got speakers from Ireland, Canada, the States, France, coming together to discuss that film. So you would be very welcome to join us anyway.
Let's close out with two final questions. One, let's talk about a film not included in the storyboards book. What do you guys think of Frenzy?
I covered Frenzy a lot in my masterclass book in 2013, mainly because the actors at the time were still with us. Alec McCowan, superb character actor who played the inspector. He gave me some great stories about Hitchcock. And Barbara Lee Hunt, the murder victim, she's still with us. I interviewed her and Anna Massey as well, and Jean Marsh. So there were some great character actors in Frenzy. He returned in 1971 to film here after, 30-year absence. So it was a very personal Hitchcock film because it's set in Covent Garden. It is quite a problematic film because of the depiction of violence. And it's actually quite antiquated, as Barbara Lee Hunt said. Hitchcock had this nostalgic view of London in terms of women's clubs, and they felt the dialogue was quite old-fashioned, the actors at the time. But I do like the kind of, if you've got the Hitchcockian humour, it's got spades of it, especially with the Vivian Marsh and Alec McGowan's dinner scenes, which are great.
Yeah. I actually don't like it, and I think it was Hitchcock did Frenzy primarily because paradoxically he was losing his it was the demise of the studios, and he was losing his ability, his power base within Hollywood. And despite being an extraordinarily wealthy man, he was losing that control. And he wanted to demonstrate that despite his being of advanced years, he could still produce a film that was going to draw audiences. And so he produced Frenzy, and boy, was it an extraordinary success. It was one of the films that he made the most on. And precisely because he wanted to demonstrate to the studios, look, this is what audiences from the 1970s. 1970s was a very violent period in terms of cinema, particularly towards women. And he wanted to demonstrate, I can produce a film that will deliver in terms of what audiences want. That's why in some ways Family Plot, of which there is a murder but it's offset, there's no violence in there whatsoever. Family Plot is actually a lot closer to a Hitchcock film for me, and I think it was for Hitchcock as well, than Frenzy was. Frenzy was all about his trying to re-establish control over his career. So to me, it's a Hitchcock, but it's, as you say, Tony, it's very much of its time, and it doesn't sit well with me. I struggle with that film, I must admit.
I do agree. I had the misfortune perhaps to see that on TV when I was illicitly staying up late when I was about 12. Thinking, oh great, it's a Hitchcock film and it stars Vanderbilt, brilliant. Yeah. Except I found it, it really stayed with me ever since, and that's the only time I've seen it, because it freaked the shit out of me when I was that age. Can we close off on a couple of the regular collaborators from an acting perspective? Have you got anything to say about perhaps his most frequent leading man, his relationship with Cary Grant, his relationship with James Stewart?
Well, as I said, his favourite was Robert Donat setting the template, but he used Grant and Stewart in different ways. Grant was a man he wanted to be, suave, handsome, the hero. Stewart was a man he was, the family man, average man, the man thrown into unfortunate circumstances, or in Vertigo, the man who becomes very much the controller, the voyeur. But I think he used them both really well. But Grant actually often complained. He would say, "Oh, you've thrown the picture to the woman again," because he was very envious that Jane Fontaine got the treatment in Rebecca, or you were sympathetic to Ingrid Bergman in Notorious. And so that for me is what makes Hitchcock brilliant, the empathy towards the woman character, which I think is very much misunderstood.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying there.
Thank you both. So Stephane's book, Hitchcock in Context, is widely available online now. Tony's book, Hitchcock Storyboards, will be out in November. Thank you for joining us all. Thank you very much to the Mayfair Times Literary Festival. Thank you for joining us, and give these fine gentlemen a round of applause.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.